Hello and welcome back to the Cellblock Scorch. I'm Cricket here to record week 23. I won this week, but actually Peishi forfeited, so I was the only entry. But I like to think I might have won anyways. Lost was our judge, and the prompt was a fairy tale with a twist. So this is called The Queen, Storyteller. Stepmother, tell us a story, Lauren burst out the instant she walked in the room. 3 pairs of green eyes looked up at her imploringly, toys forgotten on the playroom floor. Lillian, the smallest, came over and tugged gently on the queen's skirts, a pleading expression on her face. Please, you tell the best stories. She laughed, nodding to the nurse and her attendants to dismiss them, and settled onto the floor to sit with the children. Lillian snuggled up against her left side, while Laurent and Donovan sat in front of her. Laurent had his hands folded neatly in his lap, but Donovan was fidgeting with a wooden sword. Well then, Lillian, she asked the little girl, who should our story be about today? A girl, a brave girl. The boys groaned at Lillian's quick answer, and Donovan grumbled, You say that every time. Can't you come up with something interesting for once? The queen knew the boys weren't really mad. They just liked to tease their little sister. And Donovan, let's have you give us something else for this story. The queen smiled at the children's teasing. Donovan's brow wrinkled as he thought for a moment, and then he said, A wolf? Can we have a wolf? Lillian gasped, and Laurent nodded approvingly. And can it not be about a princess or a prince? Can this one be outside of a castle? Laurent had reached that age where the castle's walls seemed constricting, and he constantly searched for ways to leave, if not always literally. He knew that he still had a detail to add to the story, and jumped on his favorite theme. The queen nodded. A brave girl, a wolf, and it can't be in a castle, she mused. Let's see. I have just the story, and I think I can get you 2 wolves, Donovan. The boy beamed. She continued, Have I already told you the tale of Red Hood and the wolves? All 3 children shook their heads, and she took that as her cue to begin. There was once a girl from a noble family who lived in a kingdom very far from here. In that place there were no such ideas as men's work and women's work, so all of the children learned how to sew, how to fence, how to cook, how to ride. Now this noble girl had been gifted a particularly splendid crimson cape by her grandmother, and she took to wearing it so often that she was called Red Hood. Red Hood enjoyed her life in the town near the castle, where she had many friends, and there was always something fun to do. Red was just a few years older than you are now, and her favorite sport was knife throwing. Nobody in town could match her skill with daggers and throwing knives, not the other youth and none of the adults. Now, Red went to visit her grandmother a few times a week, and she was always very careful. Her grandmother was an herbalist, and she lived a ways outside of the village in the forest. The forest, everyone knew, was filled with witches and wolves and all manner of dangerous creatures. Safety was found in staying on the path or traveling in groups. Recently, owing to her skill with daggers, Red Hood had been permitted to travel on her own so long as it was daylight. So on this day, she made her way into the woods, choosing a smaller hunting path to make her way to her grandmother's home. Red was well accustomed to the sounds of the forest, birdsong, distant crunches of twigs under animals' feet, rustling of leaves in the breeze. Habit found her checking the knives strapped to her belt and hidden up her sleeve, grateful for the cover her crimson cloak provided her against the chill that always hung in the forest air. After a time, Red realized she had been hearing a peculiar whining noise for several minutes and determined to follow it to its source. She stepped carefully off the path, keeping good mark of the direction she went and how many paces, to be sure she could return. A short distance led her to a small glade, on the edge of which, some distance from her, she saw a large silver wolf. Its fur seemed almost white where the sunlight shined off it, but a soft gray in the shadows. One of its rear legs was caught between the jaws of a steel trap. Carefully, the girl walked closer, making sure to approach the wolf from the front, where it could see her, but at an angle so she wouldn't seem a challenge. Wolves were dangerous, of this Red Hood was well aware, but this wolf was so obviously in pain that she couldn't ignore it. It had brilliant green eyes, almost the same color as her own. She held out a palm to the animal tentatively, like she did with the dogs in the town. The wolf sniffed once, twice, then licked her palm. Red took that as a sign of the animal's trust and spoke soothing words as she approached his back leg, assuring him that she meant no harm, only to help. Perhaps this seems odd behavior from a girl who entered the woods armed against the dangers wild animals presented, but she knew this wolf was no danger. Inspecting the trap nearer, Red hissed with anger. It belonged to no hunter of the town and was obviously a poacher's trap, with padded jaws intended to catch bigger animals like wolves and bears and hold them, sometimes for days, until the poacher returned. Many poachers kept their prey alive until the last possible instance, claiming that it kept their pelts more vibrant once they had been killed and allowed them to harvest many other useful animal parts. Red and the people of her town harbored a deep disdain for the poachers who killed mercilessly and for their own entertainment and profit. The trap was well constructed and its jaws were unyielding, but she knew there must be a catch somewhere, something to spring the trap. A few minutes of investigation, taking care around the wolf's caught leg, and a great clang sounded as the trap fell open. The wolf limped quickly away, and Red spared it only a glance as she reset the trap, then threw a large rock in to spring it again. The jaws slammed shut with a force that made her wince, and she turned away, grateful to head back to the path. To her surprise, the silver wolf padded beside her, and his great strong back came up to her waist. The girl found herself scratching the top of his head as they walked, her steady pace comfortable for the injured wolf. The sunlight dappled through the trees, and they made their way down the path. Red wondered how long this wolf would keep her company, and how she would explain him to Grandmother. But then, Grandmother had surely seen stranger in her many years of living. After a time, the wolf's ears perked up and he tensed, then darted away into the undergrowth. A few moments later, the strains of a drinking song, poorly sung, drifted towards her, and the girl began to feel uneasy. Eventually, a man rounded a corner in the path, an unsettling smile stretching across his lips as his gaze landed on the girl in front of him. She took in his clothes, good quality, but dirty, as if he'd been sleeping outside for several days, and the thick leather bag he held over one shoulder, full. It did not take Red long to realize that this man was probably responsible for the trap she'd saved the wolf from. The grin on his face stretched wide as he said, "Hello, girlie. What's a little flower like you doing in the woods all alone?" Now, Red Hood was young, but she knew well what men like him did to girls they found alone. Carefully, keeping her hand hidden under her cloak, she pulled a knife from her belt, waiting for the right moment. Her knife cut through the air, thudding into a tree next to the path as the man drew level with it and his eyes widened. "That was a warning," she said, voice icy, although she was trembling. To her surprise, the man laughed, saying, "Oh, you've got spirit, girlie. I like that." Red kept a hand on her belt, ready to pull another knife, and watched as the man put his sack down. As he leaned over, a necklace slipped out of his shirt, a simple collection of wooden beads with a huge canine tooth hanging at the bottom. She gasped when she saw it, taking a half step backwards. Everyone knew the only man arrogant enough to wear a necklace like that. He called himself Wolfsbane, and while he claimed to hunt only dire wolves, the truly wild beasts that terrorized humans and animals alike, in truth he would kill anything, and he collected wolves. It was most definitely his trap that she had sprung earlier, and she was suddenly terribly glad that she had saved the silver wolf from this despicable man. He drew nearer still, stopping when he was close enough to reach out to her. He caressed a strand of hair, and again Red pulled a dagger from her belt. She nicked the Wolfbane's wrist with it, just enough to draw blood, and he recoiled. "Do not touch me, and don't come any closer. I know who you are, Wolfsbane." At these words, surprise crossed his face, and his mouth shaped a silent howl. Red Hood still held her knife ready in front of her. "And now I know that you're in our forest. I'll be telling the town elders and the castle guard. This is not your hunting ground. We do not want you here." Birdsong drifted towards them in the silence following her words, and then Wolfsbane moved suddenly, grabbed the girl by the shoulder, and pressed a wicked, jagged knife against her throat. "And how are you going to do that, girlie?" he growled, and his breath was hot and rancid in her face. "You're all alone out here. No one will hear you scream." Red was considering stabbing him in the gut and running as fast as she could when a silver blur burst from the bushes and knocked Wolfsbane to the ground. Her wolf stood atop the man's chest, pinning him to the ground and growling. This time he spoke. "How? I've trapped this wolf. I was just waiting for it to weaken another day before I—" He trailed off, and Red saw him reaching up with his knife to stab her wolf. Quick as a breath, Red threw a knife into his arm, and he dropped his knife, crying out in pain. "You mean Phil?" For in a flash, the name of the wolf had risen from her heart, and she knew exactly what to call him. Faithful. "I saved him earlier, and now he's saved me. As I said, you are not welcome in this forest. Leave." Red Hood's voice carried much more authority than one of her age usually would, but she saw in Wolfsbane's eyes that he would listen to her. She picked his knife up off the ground and then told him to give her any other weapons he carried. Fiel growled when he hesitated, and then Wolfsbane pulled out another few knives and set them on the ground in a pile. The girl picked them up, then gestured to Fiel. He climbed down from the man's chest and came to stand by her side. Wolfsbane climbed to his feet, shaking, and looked at the girl and the wolf, standing resolute and glaring at him. Red spoke one more time with a voice like ice. "I would suggest you run." He turned and fled. The girl and the wolf looked at each other a moment, then continued down the path. After a time, Red Hood and Fiel drew near to her grandmother's house, settled into a glade. The girl was immediately on edge, as the herbs and medicinal plants that her grandmother so lovingly tended had been trampled. The front door stood ajar. As if sensing her discomfort, Fiel drew near to her. Warily they walked around the back of the house, following the trail of ruined plants. What she saw in her grandmother's backyard was something Red would never forget. A dire wolf. Twice as large as a regular wolf, its back was broad and strong, leading back to its 3 tails. Its fur was the darkest black imaginable, but with a sheen that somehow was reminiscent of crow's wings, almost metallic, and it was crouched over... Red didn't want it to be true, but the wolf looked up at her with bright red blood dripping from its fangs, and a piece of her world cracked. Almost before Red knew what she was doing, a knife was soaring through the air. It pierced the dire wolf in its left eye, and the wolf howled in pain and fury. It began advancing towards her, but she had already drawn another knife and sent it flying. This time the wolf expected her attack and ducked her knife easily. Fiel charged the dire wolf and jumped for its throat. His silver was a startling contrast against the darkness of the other wolf. Red screamed in rage when the dire wolf batted Fiel away. Golden blood poured from a gash in its throat. Fiel wasn't getting up, she noticed with dread. The dire wolf turned its attention again to Red Hood, and she saw it tense to leap. A strange sense of calm washed over her as she reached for Wolfsbane's terrible, jagged knife. Then the wolf was in the air, and its paws landed on her shoulders, knocking her to the ground. With all her might, Red thrust the knife up into the wolf's heart and twisted it. Several terrible moments passed, and then Red yanked the knife back out, and more golden blood spilled down onto her. Then the strength and the life left the dire wolf, and its body fell onto her. Red Hood suddenly found herself sobbing, and she drew in great, racking breaths for a few moments before shoving the dire wolf's body off of her. Ignoring the bloody claw marks in her shoulders, she crawled over to Fiel. He was still breathing, and she reached out to stroke his fur. He opened his eyes, and to see that piercing green, so like her own, gazing up at her with clarity, started her crying again. She threw her arms around his neck and sobbed into his fur. Red did not allow herself too much time to cry. Soon she walked over to her grandmother's body and picked it up gently. Fiel padded along beside her, always just close enough to touch. She carried her grandmother inside the house and laid her on the couch, then locked all the windows and doors. That taken care of, she took an extra blanket from a cupboard and made her way outside again. This was some years ago, but in that town they still tell the story of the day that Red Hood walked out of the forest, cloak and dress smeared with gore, a regal silver wolf walking by her side, and dragging the pelt of the dire wolf behind her. The queen sat back, pleased to see 3 pairs of dazzled green eyes staring up at her again. At some point during the telling, Lillian had shifted to sit between her 2 older brothers, and now she was clutching their hands. "Wow, stepmother," she said. "That was amazing. Red was so brave." Her brothers nodded their agreement, and then Lawrence spoke up. "But what about her grandmother? She just left her there." Lillian's enraptured expression suddenly fell into a deep concern at this reminder from her older brother. Well, as soon as Red got home and explained what had happened, she went back with her parents and many of the people from the town who had been helped by her grandmother. They took care of her body, gave her a proper burial, with a week of remembrance celebrations, as was the custom in that land. The children nodded solemnly, pleased to hear that Red's grandmother had been taken care of properly. Donovan blinked, then asked another question. "Stepmother, that story seemed different than the ones you usually tell us. It felt nearer somehow." "That's astute of you, Donovan." The queen pulled aside a section of her hair and began to plait it as she spoke. "This story was different because I heard it from Red herself. I tell it how she did." "What? When did you meet her? Wow, that's incredible. Do you think we could meet her someday? Can you tell us more about her?" The barrage of questions made her laugh, and she picked one to answer. "I met Red a few years after the story I told you. Fiel still accompanied her everywhere she went. Another time I'll have to tell you the story of how we met. We were very different then. She still had the cape, but no one called her Red anymore. She'd grown up, and everyone called her Beauty. And me, well, I was a beast. But we became best friends. Even after we parted ways, we still wrote often and visited each other when we could. I was even at her wedding. She married a king, and it was terribly romantic. And was she at your wedding, stepmother, when you married Papa? It was romantic, too. Lawrence sighed in exasperation. Lillian, you were 2 when stepmother and Papa got married. There's no way you remember it. She pouted, but Lawrence paid her no mind as he looked back at the Queen. But was she there? Did we meet her? No, darlings, the Queen spoke gently, but Donovan noticed something sad in her smile. Red couldn't make it to my wedding. She passed away about a year before I was wed. The fever. I'm sure she would have loved to be there, though. As she finished speaking, she found herself being hugged by all 3 children, as if they could squeeze her sorrow away. She held them tight, treasuring the affection and her 3 precious reminders of her dearest and best friend. And that's that. I wish I could tell you any comments from Lost on this one. Unfortunately, at this point, we were just managing the Cellblock Scorch in a text message group chat, and I don't have text messages from 6 years ago. I love this piece. I'm so proud of it. Start to finish, I feel like I did such a good job with it. I love fairy tales and fairy tale retellings, and I feel like I did a good job in this one of kind of the traditional fairy tale style where she has like 3 different main events that happen to her in this story, kind of 3 different tasks our little Red Hood does. And then I liked the framework of this queen telling stories to the stepchildren. I liked having a good stepmother in my little fairy tale. And then for me, I had fun making the twist be the fact that this was a real tale, that the queen knew Red Hood. I love this piece. I'm so happy I got to read it for you all. For the next week, week 24, I prompted she had oil paint in her veins. I hope you all look forward to that and keep those fires burning.
The Cellblock Scorch is a production of Stellacore, an independent group of nerds sharing their obsessions with the world. We can be reached at thestellacore@gmail.com, through comments on your podcast platform of choice, our Instagram, Stella_core, and at our YouTube, also called Stellacore. Feel free to check out our other productions on our YouTube channel or our cosplays on Instagram. If you would like to support our creative endeavors, you can give a one-time tip to the Ko-Fi of the writer of your favorite Scorches, or check out our Patreon, linked in the show notes. There, you can access the winning Scorches and episode transcripts for free, or sign up for Spark level support for $5 a month to gain access to all of the Scorch submissions.